Hi, everybody, and welcome to the third episode of the Harry Potter Trading Card Game Revival podcast. I'm Sammy,
I'm Reese.
And I'm Huamin.
and today we're going to be talking about our tournament that we had a couple of weeks ago, I guess over the past 2 weeks, and talking about the winners of the tournament, the decks, how they played, the cards in it, all of that kind of stuff, our surprises, our not surprises, any novel ideas that we saw throughout the tournament. Two of the people on this had actually played in the tournament, so hopefully they'll talk about their decks and how their games went as well.
Don't look forward to that. We both played some pretty real decks and did really well.
Oh,
Well,
That's
yeah.
good.
I think it's really
Uh,
interesting because one of your decks was really novel, and the other one was, I think, the only like one turn kill deck that was in the tournament at all. So those were both two decks that nobody else really played. So I think that they're going to be really worth talking about for that reason, if nothing else. Even if they weren't optimized and they didn't do
Yikes.
fantastic, they were at least novel. Actually, so let's start there. We
Oh,
had a
God.
couple of novel decks throughout the tournament, mainly from some cards around Goblet of Fire, which this is the first tournament since Goblet of Fire came out. And we had novel decks around Hermione Spew, which allowed people to play non-regular starting characters as their starting character. So there's a couple of decks there to talk about. There was a bumping items deck, which was new for mono Quidditch. And then we had both of your decks. So let's just start with both of your decks. We had Station, one turn kill, and a Maxime control. So Riss, talk about yours a little bit, and then we'll go into the Station deck.
so I'll come clean right off the bat and say I did have a quick chat with Sammy before I joined the tournament. We were at 15 players, and I'm like, well, we can't sit at 15 and have people go out on a buy every round. So I'll join in. And with that, Sammy was generous enough to tell me which cards from Goblet of Fire weren't played yet in any deck list. So I jumped on Madame Maxine, and I think it'd been discussed before, but the idea was just basically to use her as a strict win con by slowing your opponent down and delaying them as much as possible. So it's a lot of removal pieces, a lot of low to the ground stuff, so I could play something on turn one, turn two, and always get damage out with her. Yeah, that's the
Yeah.
general idea. Was sort of a prison removal deck, but you could see stuff in it for the consistency sake of playing a spell every single turn because she is slow.
I was like very surprised because we played each other.
Yes.
That was an interesting match. I don't know if I sent you the video, Sammy, yet because
Yes.
I've been slacking on those. Still have like round 4 and 5 that I need to send you. But anyways, yeah, you were running like Vanishing Step, which I think is pretty cool. Brought in Your Minds, which was like really wacko.
It's such a great card for the deck because
It's
I play it turn one, set up turn like two, three, whatever I need to, but it's fits the deck archetype so well of having to really think out, not just what am I playing this first turn, second turn, lesson, etc., etc. It's really like, okay, what are they playing that I'm going to need? Is a picking on Neville good here, or are they characters that use their once per game ability and they want to get rid of? Do I need stairs to slides? Do I need the borrowed wand to get to 5 or 6 mana in time to be able to react to things? Because it's very reactive deck. So broaden your minds. Yeah, amazing.
I think it's also important to have that early damage, and having that damage turn one was also really nice. That way you're doing stuff from the get-go and you're not waiting until turn 3 or 4 before you turn on your starting character. So that I think that was a great card to include just for that reason too.
Yeah, absolutely. And
it,
it was a lot of decision making for this deck, I think, is as well, which is, having chucked it together, it's not optimized and it's not tested. So it's a lot of lessons learnt during
nice.
the tournament matches because I have to think about like, okay, what was important? And against you, Huamin, as well, I think I absolutely threw away the game just from bad piloting.
Yeah, I think you put in History of Magic from your sideboard, which I was extremely confused about.
Yes. Well, I think also I refused to play a Madame Pomfrey, and you played
Oh
one
yeah,
out.
that one. That was
Yeah.
also pretty
Because
bad.
of course,
Uh,
yeah, that's a very bad decision. Because of course, Madame Pomfrey heals 12. That's 4 turns of Madame Maxine. So like
yeah.
unless I have a very firm grip on you, 4 turns is just insurmountable.
I
Oh,
think your
I
sideboard
was,
was actually really interesting. You had Reptile House, History of Magic, Kalashu or Kulashu.
however you
Why?
pronounce that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you just explain why? Because your sideboard was wild when I read this.
Yes, so again, it was just thrown together, but the general thought behind it is basically I really need to be able to make the correct decision every single action I do. So the History of Magic, the Collar Shoe, in the main board as well, I have Missing Parchment. They're all opponent hand reveal cards. So I can tell exactly what your plan is. Do I need to be setting myself up, or do I need to be able to get to stairs to slide? Do I need to be able to put out a borrowed wand to stop you playing an adventure or a character, something like that? So it's really about like getting the information, because it is very much so a deck where you have to make the correct decision every single time. Reptile House is a card I've been on as a on the draw player, as in the sideboard. If you drop that turn one, it can slow most decks down really significantly.
And also with like the amount of starting characters that we've been seeing going way up, there's a lot less McGonagall, which is like the
Yeah.
one counter to turn one Reptile House.
Reptile House, yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting. There was only one deck that ran her as a starter, and it was just kind of a pure creature build, and it placed lower overall. That may have been partially because of the owl dragon combination, and there were just a lot of creatures that weren't optimized for the deck. But there was only one deck that ran her as a starter. I don't remember if there were any decks actually ran her in deck either. But yeah, that was just very interesting. So let's talk about your one turn kill deck too, because I'm curious to hear about how that came together.
I've been throwing around like the station one turn kill deck for a while, and then I was like, I don't know what I'm gonna play. I'll play this because the idea is really cool, even though it's not really a great deck. My original deck used to run Broken Item and Flitwick's Inspection as draw, but I was like, in a tournament setting, Broken Item's a little bit too fragile, and I can't get it to stick, so I need to find some other draw card. So I used Overloaded Schedule instead. And I think that turned out to be a mistake, because even when everything goes completely well, it's extremely hard to hit more than 3 Alley Blasts in a turn, and 36 damage just isn't enough to close out the game sometimes. Like against Jan in my first match, I missed the kill by 1 damage. And
That is the worst feeling.
It was rough, which actually was telling me that like I hadn't played the game enough and should have delayed my going off by 1 turn, because there was no way I was going to hit 4 Alley Blasts in a turn. But yeah, it is what it is. Yeah.
So your deck build was also interesting because you included Charms, Quidditch, and Transfig, and you included Spiral Dive and Victory Party, and I'm confused about the Victory Party piece. I understand the Hogsmeade Station and Quidditch to try to get up to the power you need, but talk about Spiral Dive and Victory Party a little bit, because those are interesting things to include.
Oh yeah, Victory Party is just your platform 9 3/4 number 5. Platform is just super important in that deck in order to get the number of actions you need on the turn that you go off and attempt to kill. And then Spiral Dive is just Alley Blast number 4, I think. Sometimes it's better than Alley Blast, sometimes it's not. Usually with the amount of cards that you're attempting to draw in the previous version, it would usually be better than Alley Blast, because Flitwick's Inspection into draw 12 cards is pretty good for Spiral Dive, which is why there's just 1 copy there. But sometimes it does cause problems in that you're trying to toss all your lessons to platform 9 3/4. So sometimes you just don't have any Quidditch lessons in order to play Spiral Dive at the very end. So I'm wondering if like the current iteration, I should have just run 4 Alley Blasts instead of 3 Alley Blasts and 1 Spiral Dive. But I think I also got the kill on Nikki in one of the games because I had Spiral Dive instead of Alley Blast. I needed like 40 damage, so I chucked like 16 or like 18 cards on Spiral Dive, which I couldn't have done with the Alley Blast. So I don't know.
I mean, I'm curious to see where it goes afterwards.
I'll never play this deck again because it's a very solitary deck that just doesn't. It's like the exact opposite of Reese's deck, where you're like trying to figure out what your opponent is doing. My deck just wants to play solitaire and wants you to just not mess with me until I kill you.
Well, so yours sounds much more like you're just racing to be the first person to win, whereas Rissa's sounds like it's much more interactive.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, very, very, very reminiscent of Storm decks, right? With the Hogsmeade Station to get to the higher cost spells.
Yeah, but I think both of your decks were novel and like just what they were doing and some of the cards that they ran. I've never seen anybody run Alishu before, so like that was fantastic. And then somebody running Hogsmeade Station as well as kind of like a central piece to their deck. It was just cool to see decks that were doing something new, because we had some other decks, like there were adventure decks, there were spider control creature decks, there were some other decks that were just kind of like, we've seen these before, there's nothing really novel about them, but your 2 decks were both interesting in that way. So I just appreciated them for that reason alone. But I think also if we're looking at the top 4 decks, really the top 3 decks, they all were pretty much a new thing for tournament play. I've seen some people playing with some of these ideas just in casual games, but the top 3, which were Hermione Spew that started the Fat Lady and tried to win with Oliver the Captain as an alt win con, and then a deboning lock deck, which was a little boring to watch, to be quite honest, but it was effective. And then a bumping item deck. All 3 of those were brand new decks, which I thought were really interesting. So I want to talk about those 3 decks a little bit, and we'll just start at the top and kind of work down and just talk about them. So let's start with the Spew Fat Lady Oliver the Captain deck, because we designed the Quidditch positions, 3-4 sets ago, and we really haven't seen Oliver the Captain do much. And now he did something, and he won the tournament, which was awesome. So I want to talk about this deck, and what are your thoughts behind this deck and Hermione Spew starting the Fat Lady and how well that worked and whatnot?
In testing, we did do quite a few games with Hermione Spew starting Fat Lady, but it always was back towards the original Ron type decks.
Normal characters, right?
Yeah, the normal characters where you sort of like trying to be a bit more control-y. We did not test the Oliver Captain, so it was great to see that sort of creativity coming out and things we didn't expect in testing. But yeah, it's great to see that sort of character deck exist. I think Spew is such a great card for adding more variety into the game. So of course we weren't going to catch everything during the testing because we're a smaller team, but it's good to see it, I think.
I think also there just wasn't all that much like character hate that was being run in people's sideboards, which is I think why character decks can do very well, as I showed last tournament. Like if you're not prepared for character decks, your sideboard is usually just kind of empty, and that's not a really good place to be when they can tech against your deck with their sideboard and you can't tech against their deck with your sideboard.
Yeah, I think it's with characters and even adventures to an extent, it's very, very timing based. Like you need to be able to respond to them very quickly. And character hate tends to be a little bit more specific as well. So people don't run it in the sideboard as here's a general thing I need, or like a gap that's missing in my interaction with my opponent. So yeah, it's a bit of a gap at the moment, and it's definitely taught us a lot of things, I think
what's really important is like in your main deck, you really want cards to be generally applicable, like cards that you can play in any situation, which is why we see a lot of things like the 3, I think, biggest general use removal cards are Picking on Neville, Depulso, and Stairs into Slides, in which that they can target basically everything. But Picking on Neville is actually not that great into characters once you get a little further into the match, because they can just toss their used once per game characters. And then Depulso can't even hit characters at all. And Stairs into Slides is extremely timing based. So you have like this weird situation where your like prime removal pieces don't actually do very much against characters.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. I think characters are also weak to decks that just kind of put a lot of damage on the board initially, which is usually creatures. And creatures weren't there were creature decks, but they were not really like aggro creature decks. And the entire point of this entire Hermione Spew Fat Lady deck is that your alt win con is you're not decking out your opponent, you're getting out a team of Quidditch players, and when that team is on the board, you automatically win your next turn. So the timer for when you're going to win is much shorter than most decks are used to having to deal with. And I think that was also one of the strengths of this particular deck. But I think one of the interesting weaknesses of this deck is there is no way for this deck to deal with anything. There were a lot of characters that did a lot of different things, but once stuff hit the board, there weren't spells in this deck. I don't think main deck runs any spells. It does run 12 lessons, probably just to counter Potions Project. But if a deck could get enough stuff out, like this character deck at that point was really kind of doing what you were talking about before with your station deck. It's hoping that nobody interacts with it and it can just do its thing and be left alone. So I think that there maybe just wasn't enough pressure on the board from all the other decks in the tournament to give this deck a race for its money. And I think the other strength of this deck was it ran Rita Skeeter as kind of a backup win con, which was brilliant. And in the championship match, it actually came down to Rita coming into play. And that was what helped push the deck to win the the entire thing. So that paired with Oliver the Captain was just a really great combo.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I definitely see this deck evolving, probably, to be honest, out of the Oliver framework into maybe more Rita in general. Probably move away from such a heavy character focus and into maybe playing a few spells and stuff like that as well. Because Rita seems like maybe she's not a win on the turn, but she seems like she's probably a bit more consistent once people start playing interaction with characters.
Yeah, but like if you're doing that, you're just another character deck.
But I think there's
I
also
d-
different kinds of character decks because this is
Yeah.
very, very different. Well, man, I think you actually have a Goblet of Fire character deck, and that is just
Oh,
ramping to 12, and then you're pulling stuff out. Whether it's super
that's
consistent or not, or whatever, is a different story, but it's a very different kind of character deck than this one. And then there's also like the Seamus Colin Grip Hook character deck, and that's also doing a very, very different thing than this as well. So I just think there's so many different kinds of character decks depending on your strategy, and this was definitely very different than those two.
I think Goblet of Fire decks aren't actually character decks. I think they're combo
Combo
decks. They fall
decks, yeah.
into the
That was fair, yeah.
yeah, into the like category of please do not mess with me. I just want to go off and win.
Probably.
Well, the Amanda Dippet decks are still a pretty big character deck as well. I think, though, the Spew deck with Fat Lady might evolve into something a little bit different from the current character decks, which rely a bit more on Grip Hook, I think, and be able to play a bit more removal. Maybe, as ridiculous as it sounds to us now, maybe they play Millicent, maybe they play a few more Quirrells, and they go for a bit more generic.
Let's be real. You're playing Polyakov, not Millicent.
That is very true. We did Millicent dirty, and I feel bad about that, but it is what it is at this point.
Yeah, Polyakov hits Black Bat, which is probably like the most played creature, but also surprisingly not really seen this tournament, which was really insane.
Yeah, there were a
Yeah.
lot of cards that just weren't seen, and I think two things. One deck ran Black Bat, but I think people were just either trying new decks, which is super exciting to see, or maybe the new cards that we've been making or the decks that want to run creatures just want to run something else. I don't know, but it was interesting that only one deck ran Black Bat.
Like we saw the highest placing creature deck, which was Izzy's Spiders, was actually did not really run any of the creatures that we see a lot. There were 4 sandstone gargoyles in the sideboard, and then 4 baby acromantulas because it's spiders. But other than that, like very well, I guess it was all spiders.
Yeah, and I watched the deck a couple of times, and that deck had a little bit of interaction while playing, but the main goal of that deck was just to be as aggro as possible and get as many spiders down, and then try to use. It also ran Hermione Spew with the original Hagrid from base set, which essentially buffs your creatures if they do at least 3 damage, and it wanted to just do that and then play 2 or 3 Steel Claws in one turn and just try to win that way, and it did win that way quite a few times. And people, I also noticed, we're not really running creature hate cards either. And I think that was why this spider deck did so good, is because people did not sideboard that well against characters or creatures. So those 2 decks just had a bit of an easier time, which is interesting. I don't know why there was a sudden change, because creatures have been something people have kind of sideboarded against more. But this tournament, it was just a very different deck build all across the board.
Yeah, there's so much new stuff, I think. So, like, the wide variety is expected. And I think people are sideboarding for still more generic stuff because they don't know exactly what to expect yet. You see, like, Table Trouble just sweeps any type of items through the arch, any type of spells, right? So it's a lot easier to choose those as your sideboard cards than it is to say, well, I've got Gryffindors in my main deck. It's not my starter, but Swords is really good. Do I run that, or do I go for Chilling Fog or Fuma?
Yeah. So kind of going against the creatures, another deck that ended up placing second, that was a bit of a surprise that placed second, and it wasn't expected by its pilot to play second, was a Deboning Lock deck. So this is really interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one, people tend to not want to play Deboning in this format because they just don't think it's a fun card. Most people just avoid playing it, which people tend to avoid cards that they just think are either unfun strategies or boring. So then this deck comes in and plays a second, which is kind of funny. And we also just restricted the card deboning to 1 back in June. So this is really like the first time that this deck has really been a deck in a tournament, and it's right after it was restricted, and it still did quite well. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that, which I'm sure we'll talk about. One being deboning is probably just a bit of a broken card compared to Forgetfulness Potion, which is the potion's equivalent, but actually has a cost. And then History of Magic, the book from Hogwarts History. Wait, no, I lied. Hogwarts of History, the book from Hogwarts of History, was also a very powerful card. And when you pair that with Great Hall giving you a third action, you can play deboning, get deboning back, and then still have a third action to do something else. And the deck actually, Riss, would have lost against you because its only source of damage was your starting character, and it would not have been able to play its only source of damage. And yeah, so you would have actually beat the deck strictly because they wouldn't have been able to play Maxime. So that was really interesting.
It would have been great. I could have played a Vanishing Step or a Broaden Your Minds turn 1, be 3 cards ahead, and then just done nothing for the rest of the game.
For real though, like the deck just kind of sat there at that point. And it was interesting because there were a couple of times that I watched this deck play, and it got down to like 1 or 2 cards in its deck, and then it would use Madame Pomfrey. And at that point, the lock had started, and the opponent might have had 20 some odd cards, and this boning lock deck now only has 10. But as long as the opponent has less than 3 times the number of cards, this deck plays out Maxime and then just continues to lock, and deboning triggers Maxime every single turn, dealing the 3 damage, and then you just bring it back and play it again. And then it just turns into a very dull game of waiting for 10 turns to go by, of recycling, deboning, playing it 3 damage, doing something else. So boring deck to watch. Interesting how it won, and that like lock combo that came out of everything, and Madame Maxime becoming the top card in the deck to kind of close out the game.
Yeah. I definitely think we'll have to ban it now. Get rid of it.
Well, it was funny listening to the pilot because the guy playing it was like, can we ban this card now?
Yeah.
I was looking at deboning. People were actually just like not running this card at all. Frizz's deck was the only deck that was running it this tournament. Last tournament we had 1 person that was running it. And then you have to go back to March 2023, full year, for 1 person to run it. And then you go back another 2 years to the May virtual tournament. And then we had 2 people running it, though that was both at 4 copies. And the person that was running, one of the people that was running it, did win the tournament with 4 copies in their deck. I remember playing against that deck. Yikes.
Yeah, it's just a very interesting deck build to have come out. And it ran Professor Flitwick Charms Master, which helped also give it built-in protection. So even if an opponent said like you can't play spell cards with Through the Arch or something, this deck's like, okay, I don't care. I'll just ditch something from my hand and play my spell card anyway. So the deck really was kind of built in a solid way, minus the damage source.
It sort of shows us a little bit too with as the design team, is some of the cards we go through banning is, do we need to ban everything? Because people were choosing not to play a card that is very strongly demonstrating it wins games.
Well, I'm also curious, though. I think this goes back to the Fat Lady Oliver the Captain conversation, that people, I think, in this tournament were playing much slower decks as a whole, except for the Spider Control deck. And I think the rest of it was kind of a slower build. And I think that this Flitwick deboning deck, like, you really needed your opponent to not be doing a lot because there's so much setup. You need 7 power. You need enough lessons in hand to cycle them. You need the feast that lets you get back lessons. You need a great, like, there's so many pieces that have to line up. And with people just kind of playing slower overall, that gave this deck the ability to really set up. And there's also only 2 cards that need to stick into play before you start locking them out, which is Great Hall and Hogwarts of History. So even in terms of interaction and removing pieces, there's not really that much on board that somebody can get rid of. So the deck, it just kind of naturally has a lot of things that are working in its favor, especially with how this tournament was.
Yeah, like I think the most telling thing about the state of aggro in the meta is the fact that there was one deck with Black Bat, which is like the premier poster child for aggro.
Well, okay, so interestingly, one of the aggro strategies was in past tournaments has been Professor Hagrid from either POA or Echoes of the Past. I forgot which one. one. And the entire point of the deck is you play small creatures and you get them out really quick. And Professor Hagrid essentially mitigates the entire downside of small aggro creatures. So while there were 3 Professor Hagrid decks, only one was actually like an aggro creature deck. It did place 5th. So it was right there. And I didn't watch the games that it played, and I'm sure we'll see them on their uploaded online. But did either of you play that deck and remember anything specific about that Hagrid creature aggro deck?
It's just pretty normal creatures. They just played creatures, and then that was about it. Played Steel Claw once they had a nice board. I don't know what else to say. Guessing the Pig was pretty cool.
So it's not that creatures don't really exist. It's just that you think people just chose not to play them.
Yeah, I think that's it, because like creatures are still very prominent, or should be very prominent in the meta in a very strong deck. I don't think the creature shell, like McGonagall, Transfig, Care, magical creatures for way back in like the '05 even, that shell hasn't really changed much.
Or needed
It's
to.
got a couple cards like here and there, like you can tech wanted poster or like banned item list if you need to slow down your opponent a little bit, but like the general value creatures and stuff like that just are the exact same. And we didn't see anything like that here. I guess the Haggard deck was kind of close to it. But even then, he was running more like control-ish pieces with 2 double-ended newts, 2 Cornish pixies, and 3 Hinky Punks in the main board, which was pretty interesting to me. And also Tropical Birds. Who can forget Tropical Bird?
Tropical Birds, oh my gosh.
Great choice.
Yeah, I was talking to him after during the match, I think, when he played a Tropical Birds on me. I think he was playing it just because he wanted to play the card, not because he knew it was good.
And still placed 5th, which is fantastic.
Yeah, amazing.
So I think interestingly, even though there was only one Professor Hagrid deck that was this aggro creature kind of shell, there were 2 other Professor Hagrid decks, which I don't think the main point was to do aggro creatures. It was actually a Hagrid creature corridor deck. So it ran Forbidden Corridor, and the entire point is that when the Forbidden Corridor makes you discard a card from play, you can discard one of your creature lessons and it triggers Professor Hagrid, and he's giving you benefit from that. So Corridor kind of, while you're still losing something of yours in play, Hagrid mitigates that loss and turns it into kind of a positive for you while it's just going to hurt your opponent. And there were 2 of those decks, and one placed 6th, one placed 11th. They were interesting just because I don't remember if anybody's brought that to a tournament yet, and I don't think we've seen, if anybody has, one of the decks that does this place 6th. And this is back to Rissa's point earlier. This was an interaction that I don't think we caught until like shortly after we released the set, and then I think one of the design team members was like, hey, I just realized this, and we were like, well, it's too late now. And it's really cool to see work, and it seems balanced enough because it's not placing first. So your thoughts, both of you, about this particular strategy. 2 decks ran it, which was interesting. I'm curious your thoughts.
Well, one, I don't think you should be so results focused.
Fair.
But I think the idea of running Hermione's Time Turner is actually like pretty genius with the deck, where since Forbidden Corridor is returning the lesson back to your hand, Time Turner just allows you to put that straight back into play. And it also allows you to fetch things like Corridor, which is a unique card. And the deck was also running like 1 times Dementor's Kiss, 1 times Quirrell, 1 times like Lockhart's Office if you needed those cards. So it does give you like this pretty nifty toolbox that also works extremely well with Professor Rubius Hagrid.
Yeah, I'm definitely aligned with Homin here and saying that we might need to wait and see where this goes if people keep playing it, because maybe it needs a bit of honing, maybe it needs a little bit of lessons learnt for the pilots to really understand what play patterns they need to be doing to be successful. But it's a scary card in general, Corridor, because it's just, again, like deboning is boring as shit.
Wow.
But
Cursing on this podcast.
I think there's a big difference though. Like deboning,
we'll
I
beat
think
that.
is boring. We will. I think deboning is boring because it just says don't play the game. But Corridor, I think, says like play the game, but you need to also now add in this like other side to it and think more intentional. I think it's still hard to play against, but I like it.
Corridor goes off, Corridor says don't play the game.
Yeah,
if
I
you
think
can't deal with Corridor.
Yeah, the other point to that being as well is like if they get it down before you, when you're still trying to reach to a point where you can interact with it, you can sort of be a little too late And I think the corridor may not say don't play the game, but it does say don't play the game now. You can't play it anymore.
So
It takes a while to get there.
yeah, so a question about Corridor, and then also going back to the deboning lock deck that ran Great Hall. Obviously,
Gringotts.
or sorry, yes,
Yeah,
ran
Gringotts. You were
ran
saying that a few
Gringotts.
times.
Yeah, sorry,
Yeah,
yep,
I
correct.
didn't
Thank
correct
you.
you the first time, but
No, that's fine.
yeah, I can correct you now.
So they don't play Gringotts until after deboning, obviously. Corridor comes out whenever, the deck is going to be ready to do its thing. The easiest card type to get rid of is a location because you play your own and then the opponent goes away. So these two decks kind of heavily relied on that card, either Gringotts or Corridor, to be in play. How important is it that people start running a counter to that in the form of their own one that, I don't know, if they're going to run Chamber of Secrets or they're going to run Quidditch Pitch or Orchard Pitch or whatever? How important is it for decks to start running those types of cards to counter these strategies that are relying so heavily on their own?
If you're not playing Empty Classroom to like remove their location, you're getting pretty marginal benefits out of just replacing their location with your own, unless that location like is actually extremely good for you. For example, like against Forbidden Corridor, they kind of care if you remove their corridor, but also not really because they're like cycling pretty fast. I actually disagree with you on you wait until the deboning lock to start happening before you play Gringotts. I think Gringotts is just a very strong play into decks that they have like repeated damage every turn. So something like Madame Maxine deck.
Yeah.
Right. Like when you need to wait 10 turns in order to kill your opponent, but that 10 turns went from 20 actions into 30 actions. That's very big.
Yeah, it's essentially turning it from 10 turns into 15 turns, right?
Yeah.
Which is, again, a huge difference. The same with Pomfrey. Yeah, with the Corridor deck, I think as far as people running more locations, I think the biggest thing to think about with the locations is they may be very easy to remove. So you can play your location to get rid of your opponents, but they can play another location on top of yours. It's not something that stops them from doing anything. So, like, yeah, if they're cycling through cards really quickly with the Corridor deck, they play another one over top, and it's not really doing much if all you've done is really taken a card out of their hand because it's cost you an action, it's cost them an action. I don't think they're necessarily the solve for location centered decks.
I mean, especially against this Forbidden Corridor, because if you're trying to beat a Forbidden Corridor deck in like recursion, you're probably going to have a bad time.
Yeah, it's running the time turner to go fetch more.
You just run stuff like Hedwig, which is a very classic corridor card. Or I think Stefan's deck was running 3 times Snowy Owl and like 3 times Hermes to fetch things back from your discard pile in addition to the Hedwig. Oh, and 2 Hannah Abbotts as well.
And Hannah Abbott, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways that you kill it, but they're not even like losing a card. They're losing maybe like half a card worth of value because they just put it back into their hand again.
Yeah, and then you do have to ask yourself, is my location actually getting me anything by itself? And I think a lot of them, or a lot of decks as well,
which is why
won't benefit as much.
Which is why I bring up Empty Classroom.
Empty Classroom.
Because when Corridor stops costing 6 and starts costing 9,
that's real. Rough. Yeah, that is real. And for Empty Classroom to be, I don't want to say that we didn't put a lot of thought into it, but like we designed it and we played with the number of like how much it should tax the next card played, and we landed on 3. And I'm glad that it's actually having, or could have, an impact and should have more of one. I'm glad that it did turn into that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it does exactly what it was made to do, which is good.
Yeah. So let's pivot into the third place deck for the tournament, which is a bumping item deck. It was the only deck to run Draco Malfoy Slytherin, which is the go-to item starter, and it relied on a new Goblet of Fire card called Bumping to do a bunch of damage based on the number of Quidditch items that you had in play. So it was a mono Quidditch deck that just played a bunch of brooms, broomstick, compass, books that do damage, that draw cards, and then also relied on Orchard Pitch to help get out some extra lessons because Bumping does cost, 12, I think? So it just relied on that to kind of help with the ramp as well. So thoughts on this Quidditch item Bumping deck that placed third?
First thing is that it seems like you didn't really read the deck list because it runs 7 Charms lessons in main board.
Oh my god, it does. Yes, because I think it runs Fumos in the sideboard, and that was how it was trying to deal with creatures. I forgot that there were charms in there. Yes.
It runs 2 Enchanted Tables main board as well.
Yes. Listen, I can
And
only
I
half
believe
read. I keep telling people and they just don't believe me.
1 Cheering Charm, 2 Christmas Feast, 2 Enchanted Tables, 2 Flitwick's Inspection.
Told you,
There's
I
actually a
just
pretty decent
cannot
charm
read.
suite.
All
Yeah.
right, we'll
Yes.
cut this part. We'll cut this part. Good.
No.
Also, bumping's 10, not 12, so it's not as difficult to actually address bumping. We played this deck mono Quidditch in testing, and just we didn't really see the results that this did. So it is a bit of a surprise because we did not think bumping was going to be as good. With Table Trouble running around,
Yeah.
the thought is just that, it's too easy to answer. But a few decks in the tournament are main decking Table Trouble, obviously including myself.
And me.
And it did fine.
Well, and the interesting thing is
but-
only 5 deck ran Table Trouble. Out of 16, only 5 ran that. And the rest of the decks were really just running like individual targeted stuff to remove items. So there really just wasn't much going against this card, which was interesting.
I lied. I didn't run Table Trouble main board. I thought I did. You can cut that, Sammy. But yeah, let's talk about Sammy's statistics where he's saying that 5 out of 16. 5 out of 16 are running this one card. 5 out of 16 is almost a third of the deck. That's pretty crazy.
True, yes.
That's
But it's interesting because I think on the episode a week or two ago, we talked about expecting to see more of Living Room Explosion as well as Melted Cauldron, these kind of like larger, potentially sweepy cards for items. And we didn't see, I think, either of those 2 cards in this tournament. And then we saw a limited number of like a sweep for items in Table Trouble. And I think only 1 Quirrell, which is a colorless card to get rid of items. So there just really wasn't that much item hate, which was interesting, given that in the past, Draco Malfoy Slytherin as a starter has done pretty well in tournaments.
I'll put a little asterisk next to that because I think you mentioned, Sammy, that you expect to see more Living Room Explosion and stuff.
Oh, true. Yes.
I still think it costs too much, and that's why Table Trouble is just so ahead of it in comparison.
Yeah.
Even though it hits more and stuff, Table Trouble is just so much more timely. Yeah, even the Table Troubles weren't every single deck or sideboard or anything like that. Obviously, there's the color restriction, but it is super strong against the item decks, almost auto winning sometimes.
And the deck is running like 2 Christmas Feasts to try to like counteract that Table Trouble, where if you get Table Troubled, hopefully you don't just lose, which sometimes happens. When one card sets you back like 4 actions or 5 actions, that's pretty good.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I'm curious to see whether or who Kenny played that had Table Trouble, and like actually how many Table Troubles were played against him, because that might have also influenced like the standings in the tournament.
True. I watched a couple of his games, and I know one of his opponents didn't run Table Trouble at all, and then I didn't watch the ones before that, so I can't say anything about that. I do know that when he was playing in the semifinals, he played Jonathan and the character deck with Oliver the Captain. And I think Kenny's deck, because of Draco Malfoy being able to give him extra actions, could have potentially raced Oliver the Captain to winning. The bumping items just took probably 4 to 5 turns drawing to get to lessons because they mulliganed and still had no lessons. And that set them back 4 or 5 turns, both of the games, and they just couldn't recover from that. And I think that's why they ended up losing against Oliver the Captain. So it wasn't even Table Trouble. It was just really bad luck at that point.
If you have to spend like even like 2 actions in the early game drawing cards against a consistent deck, like starting Fat Lady, which is always going to have cards to play.
And super consistently too.
Yeah, you can't get more consistent than literally starting with a character that allows you to search up all your combo pieces.
Yeah, so it was an interesting deck. Now that somebody has played it, I'm curious to see if more people are going to play it and if we'll see more iterations of this. I know that in probably 6 to 7 months, we're going to have a new set coming out, and there is going to be a heavy Quidditch leaning in the set. So it'll be interesting to see how that's going to influence this bumping item stack, if it influences it at all, or if it just kind of morphs into something else entirely.
Yeah.
Another very interesting thing about this deck is the number of 1 and 2 copies that it's running.
Yes.
I mean, it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 single copies of cards, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 copies of 7 cards that only run 2 copies. So very, very interesting spread. Playing all the different brooms as well. That's very interesting.
My question is, why are there 5 different brooms all at 1 copy when I feel like the deck should just run 4 times Clean Sweep 290?
clean sweep.
So
Yeah.
Or so
I've
not clean sweep, Comet 290.
I've since talked to the person that built the deck about this, and this spread of brooms has definitely changed, and so have some of the other cards as well. So the deck, this was a really good test run to see just what the deck was going to do, and there are definitely changes with the deck at this point. So potentially a good deck to play in a Wizarding Wars that should be coming up in December, and see how to see how it goes.
Oh God, Wizarding Wars.
Yeah, coming back strong. So
Yes.
Hopefully.
the last really novel deck, because the rest have kind of been around, but the last one that's like brand new was also starting a Goblet of Fire card, Igor Karkaroff, which prevented some damage every single turn. I believe it prevents 3 damage, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong about that because I was wrong about bumping costs and everything else. So you know what?
Sorry, it doesn't prevent damage, it reduces damage.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes. So this deck essentially wanted to say like, all right, we're going to do damage to both of us and I'm going to reduce mine. And so it tried to do that mainly through Shrieking Shack, which I believe does 4 or 5 damage to each player during their turn. Did either of you play this deck? And I'm curious your thoughts playing this deck.
I played against it. I also talking to Nikki before, and like we were kind of formulating sort of pieces of the deck together, which is why the deck was running Enchanted Tables, was because we were talking about how maybe an Igor deck goes a little bit more mid-rangey. That and then the Hut on the Rock, I think, were kind of things that we had talked about during the test playing. But it's kind of just play Shrieking Shack and then sit around, play some other cards, try to disrupt your opponent a little bit, and then wait for Shrieking Shack to kill them. If you ramp up, like you can hit Welsh Green Dragon, but otherwise, yeah, it's mostly just Shrieking Shack and some Enchanted Tables.
It's got a really
Yeah,
interesting mix of like some control-y cards with like Depulso, Hut on the Rock, Cornish Pixie, and then just some other cards like Welsh Green, Shrieking Shack. It's a very interesting deck build.
Yeah, I think there is some promise to it, or like the idea of like a sort of, it almost harkens back to those like super control-y transfig creature decks where you play like 2 creatures and then you just sit behind a ton of removal.
Yeah, I'd say also to like the point we were making before with the other main character decks is the need to be able to interact with characters or starters as well, because Maxime just loses to that. My deck just immediately loses to Igor.
Yeah, this is partially why I did not play my Shrieking Shack deck, because I knew that Nikki was playing a Igor Karkaroff Shrieking Shack deck, and I was like, I cannot beat this.
Overall, just a really interesting deck. I'm glad so many Goblet of Fire characters were tried as starting characters between Hermione Spew, Igor, Madame Maxime. It was just nice to see those. And they all kind of brought a bit of like a novel idea, which was really our design philosophy behind some of these cards. Particularly Madame Maxime, we were like, she's going to be probably a one-time character card. What is kind of a unique effect that we can give her? So I'm glad these decks actually came and did something. The other decks were, I think, more or less kind of things that we had seen before. A Dippet character deck was a little new with some of the stuff. We've seen Dippet decks, but not necessarily a character build.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't Drew try to play like Dippet every single tournament?
So yes, and I love him for that because I love Dippet, but usually the deck tended to focus more on like a Slytherin tribal theme or something more along those lines and using more creatures. This really focused more on Gryffindor Common Room and really all the common rooms and just getting a bunch of triggers from Dippet and playing a whole bunch of different things. So this was built very differently than his other decks tended to be with Dippet.
Oh, I see. Like
there's a grip hook there.
Yeah, it's like grip hook and Ron and very character based.
Yes.
Also, is this every single common room except Ravenclaw?
I believe so.
Wacko.
Bless this deck. It's fantastic.
This is amazing.
It
How
is
did I
great.
not look through this before?
Also, this deck plays 7, so like it did pretty well, and I'm not sure if that speaks to this just like mesh of everything kind of put together, or if the grip hook, Seamus, Colin Creevy basis for building a character deck is just that good. that you can throw in some other stuff and like it still is consistent enough.
I mean, I don't think that those three cards are really like going away
No,
from
no.
the meta at all. Something like that has to be a consideration when people are building their decks, which I think people just weren't really, which is why Oliver Spew Captain
Yeah.
takes the win.
I'm glad Oliver could win. Yeah, and the last thing I want to point out from the other decks we haven't talked about was in the Candy deck, less Candy decks as well. But they ran a new card from Goblet of Fire, Unplottable, I think is the card, if I remember correctly. And one of the big things with Candy decks is you really, really need Honeydukes to stick. You like if that goes away, your deck just falls apart. Unplottable is 5, just like Honeydukes, and so it ensures that Honeydukes will stick around until somebody removes this event, which is a little more difficult to get rid of. So while the Candy deck didn't perform higher, it did have this additional piece, and I'm curious to see as more people play with it, what Unplottable does for Candy decks, or if Unplottable is going to go into some other decks as well and maybe do something different too.
I'm interested in see what it will take to make a Candy deck competitive.
Yeah.
That's a good question. Candy is so slow. It goes back into like this. Oh, well, we were talking about how like the meta has kind of slowed down for some reason, and I can't quite place why.
Well, that's another thing. Do we call it a meta yet? Because I mean, look at the variation of decks we have. We have so little games played in a tournament environment where everyone's trying really hard to win.
I mean, what can you call this if it's not a meta? It might not be like the competitive HPTCG revival meta, but it is the meta that the tournament meta that we saw. Whatever the grouping of decks that were entered into this tournament is the tournament meta. Or this tournament's meta.
Yeah, so the environment in general was slow. But whether or not Candy will be able to keep up if it was to become fast, because fast is what actually wins, for example.
I think it depends on the interaction pieces, but yeah.
Like the Boning Lock is placing second. That's a fast deck.
That's a banned deck.
I think it's also interesting to talk about this. So shifting away from the decks and toward like quote unquote the meta. Typically what we have seen as the meta is essentially heavy control. Characters, Huamin, you actually won, I believe, the last tournament in May. And that was with a character deck. I don't remember if it was control-y or not. But before that, we really just saw any type of like hard control being the thing that always won and placed in the top. Usually 3 to 4 were always control-y decks with like one random thing thrown in there. So now we have a character deck which says don't interact with me. We have a heavy control deck. We have a typical spider control deck. And then we have this bumping items, which was a little different. So one of the decks is entirely out of left field, but the other ones are similar enough to kind of what we've seen typically win a tournament. So do we really just kind of call the archetype the meta and control is more of the archetype as opposed to like any specific type of deck?
I don't even think we saw a control deck.
Well,
like Frizz's deck.
I'd call Frizz's.
Really? I think it's a combo deck.
I would say probably a little bit of both. Like it relies on the combo, but if you're not controlling a lot of that stuff, you're just going to lose really quick.
I mean, that's any combo deck.
Well, true.
Yeah, I can see the point to it being a combo deck. Right. It's more like you get the 2 cards, you win, or what is it? 2 cards, 3 cards?
Yeah. 3 cards.
3 cards. Yeah, it's not controlling pieces up to that point, right? It's not saying like I'm gonna use this, and this to control.
I feel like a control deck is a deck that like plays threats and then removes all your threats or like stops you from playing your threats, which is what I guess this deck is doing. I don't know.
So you're talking more about like Finn's deck from the past where it was like remove a bunch of lessons and then play a bunch of creatures. So more of that typical McGonagall creature build.
Yeah, which I think the boning is kind of just like the stand-in for lesson destruction here, where it's like don't play the game.
Yeah, it's gone from remove lessons so you can't play your cards to you can't play your cards so don't play your cards.
Yeah. Which
that's very funny.
Is that better? Is that worse? Who knows?
So the last thing I want to shift to talk about really quick are just looking at some of like the top cards that have been used and continue to be used. It was probably a quick conversation because there really weren't any like huge changes of like the top cards used. I think that what we have seen is that people still lean on cards like Madame Pomfrey very heavily. 10 decks played her. Argus Filch is still one of the top characters played as well. The adventures are still like Through the Arch, Ep Talk, in the stands, stuff like that. Like a lot of that hasn't changed. We are starting to see some cards kind of growing from some of the other colors, particularly in Charms. Fumos and Depulso are becoming very, very popular cards to play. Depulso, obviously, because it's so good. Fumos to combat creatures. So that's interesting within the Charms realm. And in Comsi, we're seeing a lot of Cornish Pixie played as well, which I think probably one of the better designed creatures that we've made because of what it does. Thoughts on the Charms or the creatures, colors, additional cards?
No, it seems pretty straightforward to me.
I think it tells us a lot though, because it shows us what we're designing correctly, right? We can
Yeah.
see that. Well, I would say it does, because it shows us what's actually coming out and being effective. If we were to continually design cards that never see play, are we actually adding to the game as a design team? Whereas,
Which is a fair
Yes,
point.
but also, what is Depulso Gust for?
yeah, not my
The
decision.
conversation
But
we always go back to.
it's great, but again, it is limited, right? So is it like, if you were
Yeah.
to do a card effective analysis on, 10,000 games, if we ever get to that sort of thing, would you see it be unfairly or over-representative in its performance? Sure, it may be very popular because it hits a lot of things, but if you're at 6 or 7 lessons and you're playing it, it's not really any different than
Sure.
general other removal. But it does have its own limitations, so it being well costed early on doesn't necessarily mean it's doing a better job than like picking on Neville or Stairs to Slides or something like that, because it can't hit adventures and characters, and they're both still very prominent card types.
Yeah, but also, I don't know. This is a conversation for another time, probably in an R&D design call.
Well, so the last thing I want to talk about are potions, Quidditch, and Transfig. Transfig really didn't see any huge increase in like new cards. A couple of splatterings and whatnot. Stairs into Slides obviously has climbed a lot because it's a great piece to get rid of your opponent's things. But Quidditch and potions, a little bit of a sad face for potions. 5 or 4 decks played potions and 3 played Quidditch. Still the most underused colors, despite what we were trying to give it and what they have been given, which is a little sad. And Quidditch has actually seen a decent number of card shifts and how many people are playing and what cards people are playing. Potions is just really stagnant. I don't know if this is because people are shifting away from potions and Transfig, Charms, and Creatures are just that much better. If potions is more boring, if Quidditch is more boring, or why people are avoiding those 2 colors more than the rest.
I would say the thing I've noticed from looking at the deck lists is that potions and Quidditch, given the bump thing, tend to not be the colors with the finishes in them. Yeah,
That's a wacko statement right there.
with
I
the
think
bump thing, maybe it's not as competitive, and that's why it's not as common. The potions had the VTJ, and we've taken that away, and potions has sort of backed off a little bit, right? So whereas like Charms has all the big removal, Creatures has just generally playing creatures out, and Transfiguration is the removal color. It's got all the interaction pieces, so that's pretty much always going to see play until that changes.
Yeah, Potions is like the home of the original finisher, which was VTJ. But I also don't
But
think
now
that
it's gone,
VTJ
right? So
No, it's not.
as far as people playing decks with it,
Oh yeah. As far as
if
people
you,
playing the deck, like people don't seem to be
yeah.
playing VTJ anymore. But I don't think it's gone by any means. Like the
Sorry,
deck is
when I say that, what I mean is because people aren't playing VTJ, there's no other finisher that they're playing potions for. So when I say like it doesn't have the finisher anymore, people aren't playing VTJ. There's
okay.
nothing else to be playing.
I will
Pretty much
concede
fair.
that statement that people aren't playing VTJ, so there's no finisher in potions that people are trying to or play. I think the main thing is that potions is not a very straightforward color to build. Like creatures, you can just play creatures.
Charms
What
has
other
the combos and the
yeah
big damage spells.
Transfig, you just throw in whatever removal you need. But like potions, it's like you really have to ask yourself, like, where is your deck going? And like, how are you doing it? So
Yeah,
And
what
also,
exactly does your deck need from this color?
yeah,
and the way to actually like build a cohesive potions deck, I think, is harder than the other colors, which is why we don't see as much of it.
agreed. And it feels like we've kind of turned potions a little bit into more of a like anti-meta, as much as there is not a meta, but like an anti like other strategy color, but not a win color. Which are some of the things that we've done with it, like Chamber of Secrets and the one that stops searching your deck and Azkaban and a couple other cards, they're just becoming more like anti things as opposed to I'm going to win kind of things. And maybe that'll change a little bit with the next set that comes out. Maybe it won't, and maybe potions will be left behind, and Quidditch will get a bit of boost is the hope, but we'll have to see.
Hopefully something can bring, Arthur and the brass scales back a little bit, or the bulge eyes even, and you get
we did
those
see an
finishes
Arthur
being a bit
deck,
more relevant.
which
Which
was
was Transfiguration Charms, was it? Or
Transfig Potions.
that was potions, okay.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, the broken item deck.
Yeah.
Yep, he brings that to every single tournament, and I really want him to win one sometime because he keeps trying. And I think it will get all the pieces eventually. It's just finding the right balance, and it's just not quite there yet.
Yeah.
Even from this deck, what have we got? We've got Self-Stirring Cauldron, Basilisk Fang, and Holiday with the Hags.
Yeah,
Potions.
Holidays
Yeah.
with Hags.
Has confiscated
that's-
map.
Yeah,
Which is a
okay,
pretty
yeah.
real card.
So like, yeah, that's one that's almost asking the same question, right? Like, why am I playing potions? Basilisk Fang is an item, costs 6, can sort of deal with creatures, but if you're spamming out creatures, is it going to be that good? Self-Stirring
Well,
Cauldron as the
the-
ramp piece.
The thing with Basilisk Fang is that it's a very good Arthur card because hitting someone for 6, like in the mid game, playing Basilisk Fang and then using Arthur isn't that bad. Probably like killing one of their threats with Basilisk Fang, and then you're putting your own threat on the board with Arthur, and then you can toss it to Broken Item the next turn to start taking for 12. So I can see why they're running Basilisk Fang in this deck.
And I will say that
Yeah.
that pilot also says that Basilisk Fang is their favorite card that we've made, which is also why they continue to run it.
But
Okay.
and it sort of comes a question like, for the Arthur deck, is potions the best color for it? If it's only got a few pieces, is it worth looking at other colors instead with the Transfiguration?
I don't know. I've never
Yeah.
thought about this Arthur Weasley deck.
I mean, I've also built a mono charms item Arthur deck, which needs a bit more work, but I think you can take Arthur in different directions. For the broken item deck, it might be a pure transfig build, might be the best because of Dumbledore's office. Maybe it is this potion transfig thing. Maybe it's a charms transfig. I don't know. Maybe it's something to test during Wizarding Wars one week.
Yeah, that won't be me, but yeah.
So let's just do a real quick, any final thoughts about the tournament before we wrap all this up?
I should have brought my other deck, but it's okay.
Next time.
I would say final thoughts, I would say it's great to see so many different decks again, as much as we've harped on about that already. The thing I would close out with is I would love to see a few of these honed in or tweaked and perfected a bit, because I think we've really found some of the more interesting as well, but also better decks coming out of this tournament. So it would be great to see these finally tuned and playing to a very, very high level again.
It was really cool to see just how much the meta has like changed, or what people were bringing to the deck. Sorry, Reese, I shouldn't use meta in this way, right? But yeah, just seeing the amount of variety there, it definitely, I think a lot of these decks can be optimized further. There's no reason for like this to be the end point. This is just the starting point for like basically every deck here. So
Great.
I think that's a perfect summary of the entire tournament. Like, this is a great starting point for a lot of these decks. Very well said. And with that, we're going to wrap up our post-November tournament discussion. Thank you guys for talking about the tournament and for playing in the tournament. It's always exciting to get to talk to some people who have played in it, and also are on the design team and can give kind of that insight as well. So everybody, thank you for listening as well. We will be back in a couple of weeks with another episode. Until then, you can follow us on all of our socials in the description. We'll be hosting another tournament that'll be 1 day long around the holiday time if you want to join us for that. And we'll talk to you soon. See ya.
peace.
Yes.